Chapter 22, Section 2, and parts of Section 3 over the Enlightenment in Europe. The Enlightenment movement was pretty much the age of reason. It was a time when people were trying to explain human behavior as well as scientific behavior using the laws of nature and reason. The Enlightenment thinkers of this time thought that they could improve society by applying reason as well as natural laws, and that could result in social order or some kind of happiness. The Enlightenment movement, just like the scientific revolution, it encouraged the spread of new ideas and new thought. However, instead of being applied to actual laws of physical science, it was more applied to behavioral activity and social things. People were trying to understand why people behaved the way they did or why they thought the way that they did. So these were the basic foundation for the Enlightenment movement. One of the Enlightenment thinkers that we're going to talk about, his name is Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes was convinced that all humans by nature were selfish and wicked, and without government, there would be war of every man against every man. And Hobbes outlined his feelings in a book called The Leviathan. He talked about how people are in general evil, and government is needed in order to suppress humans and make them behave. Hobbes lines out that to escape such a horrible existence, to escape the existence of being wicked and selfish, people give their rights up to a ruler, and they give their rights up to a ruler in exchange for law and order, and this is known as the social contract. It was just kind of a feeling that because people are evil and corrupt by nature, they give up their rights to a ruler who in turn gives them law and order. That's where the social contract theory comes from. Hobbes felt that the best government was the one that had the power of a Leviathan, and the Leviathan is just a sea monster. So Hobbes supported the absolute monarchies that were going on in Europe because he felt like that was the only kind of government that could impose order and demand obedience. John Locke, he is another thinker that we talk about during the time of the Enlightenment, and he is actually very important because many of John Locke's philosophies have come to influence the Declaration of Independence and some of the principles that we have in America today. John Locke, he had a little bit of a different, more positive view of human nature, and Locke believed that people could learn from experience and continue to improve themselves. He felt that people were very reasonable and that they could govern their own affairs and look after the welfare of society. So he was very critical of the idea of an absolute monarchy, and he leaned more toward self-government. He felt like self-government was a way that people could govern themselves and be able to manage themselves in society. John Locke is very important because he argued that people are born with 3 natural rights. He is very much in favor of the natural rights of men. And he says that these natural rights are life, liberty, and property. And as you probably know, those rights influence the early Americans in developing the Declaration of Independence. But John Locke, he comes up with this natural right theory, and he believes that the purpose of government is to protect the rights. That is the sole purpose of government, is to protect individual rights, and that is what John Locke believes. And he feels that if individual rights are not being protected, then the people have the right to overthrow it. He came up with this theory in his book called The Two Treatises of Government. And this work, it justifies the overthrow of James II. And we talked about him on Monday. It just basically justifies that when government is not serving the purpose that it ought to, then the government needs to be overthrown. Locke is extremely important, like I've been saying, because his ideas have influenced modern democracy. Okay? He believed that the government's power comes from the consent of the people. The people are the ones who give the government power. So John Locke's ideas were the basis of the Declaration of Independence as well as the early writings of the Constitution. In France, during the Enlightenment, there was a group of thinkers that came out called the philosophes. And the philosophes were pretty much social critics, social thinkers in France, and they believed that they could apply reason and logic to all aspects of life. They had 5 characteristics that the philosophes lived by, and they had their 5 concepts that kind of created their philosophy. The first was reason, and they believed that all truth could be discovered through reason. The second is nature. They believed in the natural laws of politics and economics. The third concept was happiness, and they believed that if a person abides by the natural laws of nature, that they would find happiness. And they believed that happiness was possible. And this is kind of different from the Middle Ages, medieval times, when people kind of thought that living on earth was misery and you went, after you died, that was when you got your eternal peace. But people that were in the Enlightenment started to believe maybe actual finding happiness is possible. So these philosophes kind of fostered that idea. The fourth concept of their philosophy was progress. They believed that in progress for society, they thought that using a scientific approach, that society and humankind could be perfected. So they were always thinking of new ideas. And the last, probably most important idea that the philosophes came up with was liberty. They believed that society could be set free through reason. They thought that society deserved freedom, and especially in France during this time, there were lots of limitations on religion. There was lots of limitations on speech. People were very limited. These philosophes were pioneering these ideas of individual liberties. One philosophe from France, his actual name is Francois Marie Arouet, and his pen name was Voltaire. You probably have heard of Voltaire, but Voltaire was just a writer and a philosophe, and he, in his works and in his thinking, he basically targeted the clergy, the aristocracy, and the government in France. He was sent to jail twice, and he was exiled to England for 2 years for his thoughts. However, while he was in England, he came to really admire and respect the English government because of their freedoms and the English Bill of Rights. So when he returns, he mocks the religion and government of France, and he kind of makes it his life mission to fight for tolerance, fight for reason, fight for freedom of religion and freedom of speech. And we've seen those things in our Bill of Rights in the Americas. But Voltaire kind of makes it his life's goal to fight against intolerance, fight against prejudice, and fight against superstition. Another philosophe that is extremely important in shaping the United States and their government was the Baron de Montesquieu. He was a French thinker, and he devoted his life to studying political liberties. He did extensive study on the fall of Rome and concluded that the reason why the Roman Empire was not successful was because the people lacked political liberties. He pioneered the idea of separation of powers. After studying British government and looking at the government of England, he decided that the British had the best government because it was separated into 3 separate groups. As you well know, in our current government in the United States, we have separation of powers in executive, legislative, and judicial branches. He wrote on the spirit of the laws, and in this work he argues that separation of powers would keep any individual or group from taking unnecessary control. So Montesquieu kind of pioneers this idea of democracy and pioneers these ideas of separation of powers, trying to make everything equal. He also talks about checks and balances and making sure that each branch would not have control over any other branch, that everyone has equal power. So Montesquieu's ideas were applied to modern democracy in that way. Another philosophe named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he also was very instrumental in forming American democracy, because he focused his thinking committed to individual freedoms. Rousseau, he was the son of a poor Swiss watchmaker, and he made his way to Paris because he was a writer of essays. He gained some recognition for some of his essays. Rousseau is very different because he disagreed with the Enlightenment thinkers, and he argued that further civilization and progress actually corrupted the natural goodness of people. So he was very different than the other Enlightenment thinkers who urged progress and urged improvements in order to improve society. Rousseau, he once wrote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." He really thought after people become civilized, they start wanting to obey unjust laws. And if they start obeying unjust laws, their freedom and equality are destroyed. So he was kind of different in that way. However, Rousseau agreed with Locke on several things. He believed that government should be based on the consent of the governed. So the government should respond to the consent of the people. And he believed that all people were equal, and any kind of nobility, any kind of noble titles needed to be abolished. The main impact of the Enlightenment movement was it really challenged these long-held ideas about society. It made people re-examine the theory of the divine right. Did monarchs really have the divine right to be in power? It also started to form and popularize new theories and new ideas. People were starting to come up with new ideas, especially on government, about liberties. People were starting to understand and wonder if government needed to be offering more civil liberties. This kind of thinking really encouraged the monarchs to make reforms and to change the way they were governing. But it's important to know they were not revolutionaries. These philosophers did not want to overthrow the government. They just wanted to make the necessary changes. However, the theories that they came up with inspired the French Revolution in France as well as the American Revolution in the colonies. A new era of monarchs came out of the Enlightenment, known as the enlightened absolutists or the enlightened despots. Enlightenment thought really started to influence monarchs throughout Europe. Now, they had no intention of giving up power, but they started to rethink the way that they were governing and start to use these Enlightenment ideas of government to kind of better and strengthen their empires. These monarchs were known as enlightened absolutists or enlightened despots, and a despot is just someone who has complete control. They kind of changed the way they were thinking. We know that early absolutists, even Louis XIV is known for saying, "I am the state." Well, these enlightened absolutists have taken these Enlightenment ideas, and they believed that the ruler needs to serve as a servant of the state. They're no longer considered the main power, but they need to do what is best for the government. So they started to take these Enlightenment ideas and use them to make their country stronger and to be a more effective ruler. And some great examples of the enlightened despots or the enlightened absolutists, number one would be Joseph II of Austria, Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, among a few. These were just some of these people that decided that they were going to change the absolute monarch and kind of modify the way they were ruling. So the Enlightenment was just kind of a time for reflection and thought and